Well, thank you so much for having me. Recording is in progress. Good that everyone can hear me okay. Fantastic. This is our sound check portion of the presentation. So I'm going to share slides so that you don't just have to watch me talk this entire time, as fun as that would be. I am not going to be able to see most of you while we do that. So please, if something isn't working, please verbally interrupt me. Okay, so thank you for that kind introduction and for inviting me to take part in this. I love talking about podcasting, so this is a huge treat for me. I'm a postdoc at the University of Guelph and the science director for the Coastal Routes Project and co-host and producer, et cetera, of the Coastal Routes radio platform, we'll call it. I guess can start by acknowledging where I'm at. So I am not actually at the university today, but I am here in Guelph. And we're located on the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron people and the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I think along with the university community, I want to recognize that I am an uninvited settler guest on this land. And with that, am learning to recognize and appreciate and lift up the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant that belongs to this land, and offer my respect to the people who have been here since time immemorial, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis neighbors, as I try to understand my place in relationships with those peoples. The outline for today's talk, a little bit of an introduction of myself. Who are you listening to and why? Understanding what knowledge mobilization is, what it is all about. I'm sure you've probably heard a little bit of this already in the previous sessions, but we'll just kind of develop a working definition of what knowledge mobilization can be. I then want to spend a little bit of time talking about sort of the philosophy, if you will, of podcasting. So in my view, all great knowledge mobilization, particularly that depends on the human voice, is tied to storytelling, to being a good storyteller. That's really what can make it effective. So we're going to spend some time thinking about what that means. I then want to talk about the human voice itself and just how freaking cool it is and how special and unique it can be in doing things like sharing, mobilizing, translating knowledge. We'll then get into kind of the ins and outs of podcasting, what it is, how you do it a little bit. We'll then have a break because lots of Zoom. And then we'll get into kind of the more workshop hands-on part of this. I've asked each of you to consider something from your own work that you can imagine maybe would be a good topic for a podcast, whether a series or just one episode. And we're going to spend some time fleshing that out, developing that a little bit. And my hope today is that you walk away with some really awesome materials in hand and resources that you could use to finish this process, but that you also have a clear idea of the steps and what your idea might look like in its finished form. Hoping that my keyboard works. Yes, here we are. I'll introduce myself a little bit more. So you know that I'm a postdoc these days. I'm actually originally from Alaska. I did my bachelor's and my master's degree at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where it is very cold right now, and I am grateful to not be there. I did my PhD at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, which is just a little bit outside of Oslo. And my training is in the qualitative social sciences, particularly within natural resources and fisheries. And my, I guess you could, my title or my field would be as a human ecologist. And I'm really interested in the many, many ways in which human relationships with the environment take place and transform, and how we can learn how to maybe redefine or rehab those relationships within the context of a changing climate. So to do all of that, I spend a lot of time out in the field. I'm an ethnographer, and I work right now on the Great Lakes commercial fisheries. So I'm particularly interested in the ecological and social challenges that they face as a contemporary fishery. So they're well known for who they were, say, 50 years ago, but the relationship between the public and the consumers of the fish that come out of those lakes and the actual labor and livelihoods that are behind them has really kind of disappeared or weakened over the last half century. So I'm interested in understanding why that is, and also the things that the fishery is doing well, and particularly around how it provisions food to local food systems within Ontario and Canada more broadly. So you can find me on social media if you're into that sort of thing. I'm Fish People Place pretty much everywhere. I wouldn't say that I'm the most interesting person on social media, but I do post a lot of fish pictures. So that's something. Um, Lately, and because of COVID, not only because of COVID, but largely in part due to COVID, we have transitioned the Coastal Roots Lab and the my work as a podcaster or as a person who enjoys doing knowledge mobilization into podcasting and film. So currently, I'm working on a documentary film about Great Lakes fisheries, and the podcasting work has really kind of taken off and become its own thing. So we started social fish distancing as a way to stay engaged with the changes that we were seeing in small scale fisheries over the course of COVID. And that has since morphed into Coastal Connections, which is also through Coastal Roots Radio and is part of our project team on the East Coast, that they were able to take on a podcast that looks at issues on Canada's Atlantic seaboard. And now the next product will be a podcast called Fishing Forward, which is going to debut in January of next year and will be all about health, safety, and, as we like to say, staying ship shape in the commercial fishing industry. There's going to be a lot of fish puns in this. I'm just going to warn you about that right now. We think we're very funny. So anyway, I'm happy to answer more questions about my background and kind of how I came to where I'm at the end of the talk today. But I like to share this because I think everyone has their own story and how they got to where they're at. And mine is certainly not as straightforward as I think others might be. So anyway, I really enjoy what I do now, and it's a treat to get to share that with you. So I mentioned Coastal Roots Radio, and these are our podcasting projects. I said we started this due to COVID. We did as kind of a Hail Mary, honestly. We were planning to do a lot of work with what we call alternative seafood networks. So that is small scale fisheries, along with the local catch network, which is sort of a hybrid practitioner academic network out of the United States, but that covers the US and Canada, and that focuses on that type of a fisher. And we had planned to do all of this work with them in 2020. And then COVID happened, and we heard just so many stories coming out of the woodwork about, wow, we have such a huge demand for seafood, from people who are walking into the shop that I run or walking out to the dock and asking me, I'm on my boat, can I buy your fish? And that was really kind of the opposite of what we were hearing in grocery stores. If you remember back in the first days of COVID, we saw a lot of empty shelves. And one of the major supply chains to get disrupted was that of seafood, because it requires so much infrastructure and a lot of people working in close quarters. And suddenly we didn't have any of that, and you couldn't fly anything anywhere. So fish counters were empty, but people really still wanted that fish, and we were interested to follow that phenomenon. So we use social fish distancing as a research and knowledge mobilization hybrid. And I think in general, today's talk is going to focus a lot on academic podcasting, but many of the tools that you'll develop could be used for any type of podcasting. But in this case, we were really interested to see, can we use the podcasting process as its own form of data collection and its own approach to research. And we found that we could quite successfully. Obviously, there were some strong learning curves there as we were all trying to cope with this new world. But it really was an interesting way to be able to take what we were learning and turn it around quickly and share it with people in kind of a peer-to-peer learning style podcast intended for fishermen to be able to hear the stories of other fishermen. And at the same time, be able to do all of those interviews and then build this really robust data set from which we could later draw and write papers. And we were able to do that successfully. So Coastal Roots Radio, Social Fish Distancing was based on about 120 interviews conducted over the course of, I'm going to say 9-ish months, off and on. And there were 3 of us doing those interviews, 2 of us who did most of them, and 1 person kind of doing the background work of putting the podcast together. So a huge amount of work. And I want to be honest with you about that up front, because I think people think, wow, podcasts are so hip and trendy right now. Everyone wants to have a podcast, but it's a lot of work. Just like any great output, the work you put into it is really going to be reflected in the work you get out of it. So I do want to draw attention to this. I think I mentioned already that you can click on these links when this is distributed later. Wherever there's a little microphone, it's a link. So this will take you to the Coastal Roots Radio page and our main website, so you can look more into that. And this is also a shameless plug to check out the Fishing Forward podcast in January. Okay, So let's start with a conversation about knowledge mobilization. Today, we're talking about podcast as a tool or as a vehicle toward knowledge mobilization. And I hope you can't see that. You can't see my little thing, can you? We're going to just make it go away and then that solves the problem. Okay. So podcasting is knowledge mobilization. I think people often, I see it written in grants or in job advertisements, like, must have knowledge mobilization skills. And what does that mean? It really, a knowledge mobilization is this umbrella term that encompasses this huge range of activities. But its idea is to, I think, package and share in a legible, accessible way research results. Now, does it have to be research? I don't think so. I think that knowledge mobilization can really take place for anywhere where knowledge is being produced. Research is one specific way of doing of producing knowledge. But importantly, who creates it matters, how it's shared matters, who it is aimed at matters, and how it's made, how accessible it is really matters. And so in all of that, I think that I really like this image. This is from the University of British Columbia's Indigenous Studies in their kinesiology program. And here, I think they've linked together a lot of the really important things that knowledge mobilization can be many things, and it depends on what you're using it for and for whom. So in the case of podcasting, we are not really doing exchange. So it's kind of a one-way funnel of information from you, the producer of that podcast, to the listener. You can create ways that people might be able to engage back with you, but it's not really a conversation so much as a bit of a monologue, shall we say, or a lecture of sorts. But the idea is, of course, within it, that you're making it so engaging that somebody feels like they're being spoken with instead of at. You're able to share, you're able to transfer knowledge, disseminate some findings, perhaps. It's also a great opportunity for translation, for making knowledge into a more, as we say, legible or accessible, but something that the average person would be able to engage with, understand, and take something away from. The other thing I really love about podcasting is it does create this opportunity to archive and to share quickly what you're doing in your research. So you're able to take those, say, if you're doing interview-based work, you're able to take that information and turn it around by sharing kind of these bite-sized pieces of it in your podcast. And again, that will depend on the format. We'll get into that in a few minutes. But you're able to really let's say, overcome one of the frustrating sometimes bottlenecks of academia, and especially of qualitative work, is that it can take so long to take qualitative data and make it into a shareable product. And usually that's in the case of a journal article or some sort of peer-reviewed piece. But if you are able to write in your ethics that some of this will be turned into a podcast, then you're able to do that much quicker. But you're also able then to make transcripts of podcasts in the same way you might do a transcript of an interview. You can make transcripts of those podcasts and create those, rather share those through a website or through some place where that improves accessibility if someone isn't able to engage with the audio product, but also kind of archive that narrative, that analysis that you might be doing as the host with that data. So I'll explain, I think, a bit more of that as we go, but that's, in a nutshell, it's broad. Don't let knowledge mobilization, or the idea that knowledge mobilization is one thing, scare you away from experimenting with the way that podcasting or essay writing or photography or any other maybe non-traditional means of capturing ideas and sharing them with a general audience, that those are all valid ways to do that. And it's, I think, really something that we have to be reflexive about in thinking of our role as that knowledge lens. How are we translating? How are we changing the intention or meaning of that knowledge as it goes forward? Okay, so I talked about storytelling. Storytelling is super important. In a podcast, you have to recall that this person your listener really has no way to see you. They have no way to read your body language, to understand anything else about you other than the content of what you're saying and the way that you sound. So to set, and we know that humans are gifted storytellers. We are good at hearing things through stories. We're good at receiving information, lessons, intention through story. And we're also good at framing our experiences through a story. So if you think about it's all, say something on TikTok or a great meme, something that you've seen, it's something that tells a really compelling story in a super small amount of time. And the things that go viral are because you feel like you got into what was going on, you were entertained or moved, or somehow an emotion was elicited within you almost immediately. And then you were either left wondering, or there was a hopefully satisfying conclusion to that. And we see that a lot. I admire the heck out of really great TikToks or Vines, if you're old enough to remember Vines, because wow, in 6 seconds, people can tell this incredible blip of a story. And you feel engaged with that. You feel entertained by that. So with podcasting, thankfully, we have more than 6 seconds. We're here with a bit more time, and we have more flexibility in how we create that story. If you think back to maybe an English class you took in high school, you'll probably remember that classic. We have kind of an introduction of characters. We have settings being built for us. We have some exposition. We have the rising action. There's a problem that's happened, and now we're trying to solve the problem. There's some big climax, Frodo on the volcano getting carried away by eagles. And then there's the resolving action. Also hope that people watch Lord of the Rings, because that may not make a lot of sense otherwise. That is a story arc. That's a way that we are taught to tell stories. But there are many other ways to tell stories. And when you're missing the visual component of that, you're, I think, challenged to do that in other ways. So whether that's setting up a story that tells itself in reverse, or whether you're trying to let other people tell bits and pieces, and you're trying to thread those things together for your listener. Many different formats. However, in my experience, there are 4 key things that every story really needs to have, and when it comes to a podcast. So first, having that central problem or the lesson. What is the reason you're making the podcast? Some of the most frustrating podcasts I listen to are where it's not really a podcast about something. It's more like daytime DJs on the air, where they're just chatting and kind of entertaining each other. And the person listening isn't necessarily in on the background of that conversation. And so while they might be having a good time, or sometimes people just like to hear background noise, which is maybe a perfectly legitimate reason to make a podcast, it doesn't really tell a compelling story. Compelling stories are also based around having strong characters in settings that are legible to the audience. When I say legible, I mean understandable. There's something that they can, even if they're not familiar with that place, they can kind of get a feel for what that might be like. You might be that character. You might have interviewees who might be that character. You might, let's say you do a fictional podcast where you tell stories, or you read from old fairy tales, or any number of these kinds of popular bedtime style podcasts these days. They have a character, but they are really doing a good job to create the land in which you are living briefly while you listen to that content. The key message, also important. Sometimes we hear podcasts that have a really strong problem, but the message of that problem isn't really clear. What are we supposed to think by the end? If anyone here has listened to the podcast Serial or S-Town, both hugely viral, major podcasts, they have a really core central problem. They have really strong characters in a really tangible setting. But the key message in either one of those is mixed. We leave especially the first season of Serial, and the maker of that podcast, Sarah Koenig, talks about not having a real conclusion, and that she struggled with, how do I end this podcast? How do I end this season? Because there is no main takeaway here other than maybe that the American justice system is a problem. And that is a message, but is that something revelatory to the audience? Perhaps not. So that's, I think, an important thing to consider. What are you trying to say? And then finally, having that strong narrative, that red line of and not really argument necessarily, but that thread that we can kind of follow throughout our journey with you as the podcast host. Really important to have those components in there. Okay, so this is one of my favorite topics in the world. I want to talk to you about the power of the human voice. You've been listening to my voice for quite some time now. And maybe before I dive into this, I'll ask, are there any questions about what we've covered so far? Okay, I am hearing none, which hopefully means that there are none, and not because that somebody can't hear me. my great nightmare is having done a really long talk on Zoom and nobody decided to jump on and tell me. Anyway, let's talk about the human voice. So I want to share that with you this quote. This is by Stephen Henn. He's the, I think, the creator of 60 decibels, but is a former NPR contributor and a very accomplished journalist. And he says, think of everything you learn by listening carefully to someone talk. Often you can guess their age and their gender, maybe where they grew up. Often you can feel the emotions they feel, their happiness, their fear, their love. Voices can create empathy and understanding. They transmit emotion. We are wired to feel each other this way. I love this because I could not agree more. This is from an essay that you can find linked in the microphone down here. I think there's something really critical about understanding that our voices, the way we move and shape air as a species, is something kind of unique to us. We are able, other animals, other creatures on this planet certainly make noise. They sing, they chirp, they whistle, but we are able to do so much with our voices. And that ability to, without touching someone, without even needing to be in the same room as them, without knowing them at all, to be able to make them feel a certain way because of what you said, because of the sound you made, that is a really powerful tool that we have. And I think we sometimes, because it's the way we communicate, it's the way we go about our lives, we forget the magic of voice. And that's something I find so compelling about a great podcast. In shaping this, I will say that getting used to your own voice is traumatizing. Most people are not comfortable with hearing themselves on the air. And we all have, I think, quite a lot of range in our voices. So I'm going to pause and I'm going to ask everyone to be very brave here and join me on your camera. Join me because we're going to do a little exercise. I'm going to turn off my headphones for a moment. Okay, can you still hear me okay? All right, so I'm going to tell you, get your hair back out of your face if that's your thing. And we're going to do a little exercise. So getting used to your voice. So essentially we have three parts to the way we create noise as a human. We have the bellows down here in our lungs and our diaphragm. That's how we move the air around. We have all of the different tissue and stuff in our throat, vocal cords, et cetera, that create tone and pitch and that move things around. And you can kind of mess with that if you play with your voice and your vocal cords. And then we have all of the enunciator pieces. So that's all of the junk in our mouths and in our nose. So when we are literally playing our bodies, so we force air out of a set of holes, the way we shape those holes is how we shape language. And of course, that's why languages sound differently, et cetera, et cetera. So getting used to how you sound means getting to know your own voice. So women tend to have a shorter set of different types of tissue in our throats, our larynx, and all of these different parts, the folds and the flaps within our throats tend to be a little bit shorter, and thus they create a little bit of a higher pitch. Men tend to have longer, but we all have quite a lot of range. And the range that we normally speak, so my normal speaking voice tends to be a lot like this, but the way that I can relax those things, allow all of those muscles to lengthen, and then engage a deeper, softer, more intentional voice. And reach down into my lower register a little bit, slow down because we're better at listening to something we can comprehend. All of that takes practice. And so I'm going to ask everybody, you can mute yourself. That's totally fine. But I'm going to ask everybody to, we're going to say a few sentences together. So you're going to say, hello and welcome to Social Fish-Tensing, loudly to yourself in your normal speaking voice. Go. Okay, so now I want you to deep breath. Let that breath all the way out. Relax your shoulders. Try and relax your jaw and your throat. We hold a lot of tension like this, especially when we're at computers. So, oh yeah, let all that kind of relax back into our body. And then we're going to think soft, think kind of lengthening. Imagine that you just swallowed something honey and honey and something oily, something that lubricates. I know it sounds ridiculous to imagine it, but it does help. So imagine something really nice that just warmed your voice. And now we're going to say it again. Hello and welcome to Social Fish-Tensing. I'm letting you keep your mics off because, this is mortifying for everybody, but I still want to hear it. So did you notice a difference? Were you able to access something a little deeper in yourself? Fantastic. So that is part of practicing your radio voice. The other fun thing about your voice is that we can fake emotion really, really well if no one can see us. So if I say, welcome to Social Distancing, my name is Hannah Harrison. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm sure it's information you have received the point of the sentence. However, hello and welcome to Social Distancing. My name is Hannah Harrison, and it is a pleasure to be here today. That is the fake smile. I do not smile that way, but a fake smile will change the shape of your mouth into a shape that we hear as happy, warm, welcoming. So you can literally hear a smile on the air. And it's just an easy way to change the tone of what you're trying to share with someone. So the last thing we'll do is getting used to how you sound is difficult because how we sound to ourselves is not the true sound of our voices. Obviously, we're receiving that sound not only through our ears, but also through our bone structure in our head and the ear bones that we have. So I'm going to ask everybody to take your hands, make two flat planes, and you're going to place them right in front of your ears like this. So take it off, say, hello, my name is, and then your name. Okay, and now put it back. Hello, my name is, and then your name. I love this part. So do you hear how it's like kind of more hollow sounding? You might be getting a little bit of echo out of the room. It's not a perfect rendition of how others hear your voice, but it is closer. So getting used to how you actually sound, tricky, challenging, but you can do it. And I believe. Also getting used to how you sound you can change the way you sound, but you have to know what that sounds like first. So spending time on that is good. Most software that we use to create podcasts, that we use to make any audio product these days has filters, just like anything else, there's all these ways to kind of put a little shine or put a little better tone in and how you sound. But your own voice is really the most compelling way that you can communicate. So I encourage people to get comfortable with it. All right, experiment over. Back to the human voice. We'll dive back in. Oh dear, what have I done? Here we are. Okay, so we'll get back into this. But anyway, I like to spend a little bit of time on that, because I find it just so, I guess, deeply compelling to hear others and to be able to transmit that way. Podcasts make me cry far more often than movies do. And I think that's in part because I'm getting to create something in my mind that's informed by this special thing that we offer each other. The last thing I'll say about this is I don't think that many people realize how unique it is to be able to hear a recording of another person. So even in the last few generations, mass-produced, easily affordable, and frequently used ways of capturing voices and being able to share them or keep them and revisit them for years and years and years afterward. That's a fairly new thing that we're able to do. Like even, say our grandparents, they wouldn't have necessarily had a ton of easily accessible, readily affordable, easy to use, turn the phone on, capture someone's voice and have it forever, especially at such high quality that we can do that now. So essentially our voices are time capsules of who we are and the times that we live in. And we can hear that in accents. We can hear that in, old timey news footage, particularly from the United States, where people are like, the Atlantic seaboard today, like that mid-Atlantic accent, almost gone. It's almost extinct from American society. But that used to be the way that people pronounced the news. Anyway, so I'll leave it there, but I think it's important to get to know your own tool in this respect, if you're going to jump into the world of audio. So I think the other exercise I like to do here is the way we say things really matters. And so I'm going to turn off my camera. And I want you to just listen to each of these and hear the tone. And as soon as I finish the sentence, imagine if you had just heard that sentence, how would you feel about my what I was trying to tell you? What message was I trying to share? So that we're going to use the sentence, she did not take his money. You can change the intonation of each of these words in this sentence, and it changes the meaning of that sentence. So she did not take his money. 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 In each of those, the sentence is changed, isn't it? So, when we think about how we're putting together phrasing, sometimes things that work really well in writing are terrible when spoken out loud. And we're going to come to that a bit later with scripting. But it's a challenge in podcasting or in any audio product to take what we're used to doing, which is writing in academia usually, and translate that into how would I say this? And does it mean the same thing when it comes out of my voice? So just another example there, if you want to practice your way through that. Come on, keyboard. There we are. Okay, so now let's talk about podcasting. What does go into a podcast? What are they made of? How do you do it? Okay. First, I would like to hear from you. What are some of your favorite podcasts? I'll stop sharing there briefly. So it could be anyone you listen to, but I want to know what it is, why you like it, and if you're able to articulate it, what the format is. So is it one host? Is it two hosts? Do they tell stories? Is it about the news? Is it a review of music? Kind of give a 2-second description of what it is.
I'll go first. I really like, there's one called CBC Uncover. It's like investigative journalism. So each season is a different reporter, different topic, but it's something that they've covered for a long time. So it's kind of a deep dive. And I think I like it because it's like current events, but it also traces like a lot of kind of, it goes into a lot of depth. It'll cover a lot of history. It'll cover lots of different things. So much more than you get in like a quick newscast, I guess.
And how do you feel when you listen to it?
Often very like surprised. I think it like by getting really deep into the story, I'm like, whoa, I understand like so many things that I wouldn't have understood otherwise. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's hear another one.
I can share one, I guess. I also like to listen to a bunch of like CBC ones that are like Unreserved is one, and a couple other ones like that just provide a different perspective of like current events from different populations that differ from my own perspective, I guess, as a white person. So gaining like different perspectives through podcasts is a really good one. And then also I find myself listening to a variety of comedy podcasts because I think a lot during the day, as I'm sure everyone else does in academia. So it's nice to have a break through like a comedy podcast, I find.
And so how do you feel when you listen to the first category that you mentioned?
I guess like just open and like curious, I guess would probably be the main descriptor I would use.
Word, yes. I love that you brought up that sometimes you listen to comedy podcasts because it's a break. Oh man, same. That is, people often use podcasts because they want a break from reading and they want to clean the house and learn something at the same time, or be entertained or be inspired. I love that you said curious, that you said the word surprised, Kyle. Like those are, I think, frequent experiences that people have listening to podcasts. Is like, wow, I just learned this new thing, kind of this intrigued, but in like a delightful and kind of light way sometimes. As we think about this, I wonder if that was the intended emotion that the producer of that podcast wanted you to feel. And that's, I think, a very important question we're going to ask ourselves later. So what is it we want people to feel versus what the experience they're actually having listening to that podcast? Okay, let's hear one more.
I can go. So I really like Science Versus and also Burn It All Down. And I think for similar but a little bit different reasons. So Science Versus is like really kind of shorter, deep dives into like a kind of quirky topic. Like you'll learn a lot about, like one episode was about shark attacks, and they like talked about like the prevalence of shark attacks and like why like media and like society is like kind of interested and like terrified of sharks and those sorts of things. And yeah, they're just really like kind of strange topics that you wouldn't really think about in a scientific way, but they do a good job of like pulling lots of different perspectives and scientific literature to tell an interesting story. And then the other one is Burn It All Down, which is more of like a conversational podcast on sports and from a critical feminist perspective. And whenever I listen to that one, I feel like I want to be friends with the women that like put that on, because they just have really interesting perspectives, and they love sport, but they're also critical of it. So that one's really fun to listen to as well.
Fantastic. Those are all such good examples, and such a diversity, which I also love. We're really in the golden age of podcasting. There are so many good ones out there. And I love talking about it because I always hear of a new podcast and that I'm excited to listen to. I'd say that my favorites probably are some of the Canada Land series. Thunder Bay was one of my favorites. And it made me feel deeply depressed and concerned. But it also made me feel, I think, an inner pissed offness, but accompanied by a need to do something, to be better, even if it was just to learn more. And that was, I think, a very difficult but compelling feeling. Whether that's what they intended, hard to say. It was also very informative. I learned a tremendous amount as a somewhat recent immigrant to Canada. And in the States, some of my favorites are probably Radio Lab or This American Life, both of which Radio Lab is more kind of two hosts that host stories and talk about it together with tape in between of the interviewee or the place they visited or wherever, and a huge variety of topics. And Kyle, I did as well. It was a late night. And then This American Life is very story based, and they tell their podcast in acts, like Act 1, Act 2, and in each one it's kind of a discrete but linked together by a theme set of stories. And that was probably one of the first podcasts I ever really got into, but it started as a pre-recorded radio program on NPR that was distributed, and that then became available in podcast form. So that's also, I think, another important division is we have podcasts that are created just to be a podcast. And then we have a lot of content these days that is aired somewhere on a public radio or, the signaled radio, and then is made available as a podcast format later online, which of course is a great way to get your content out there and make sure more people have the opportunity to hear it. So really nice. One of the other ones I've really enjoyed is Rural Roots, which is made by Boyan First and company, and is a really excellent exploration into what rural means in the Canadian context. And that was one of the first partners we ever had who coached us in podcasting. So credit to Boyan. All right, so let's go back in then. So we heard of a few different formats just now, and I think that's one of the first questions I ask people. They say, "Oh, I'm interested in doing a podcast." Great. What format are you considering? So there are a huge number of them, and of course, a hybrid version of any and all. We use an interview-based podcast format for social distancing. Those interviews are pre-recorded and we select from them. So it's heavily edited, heavily produced. And then we have, in that case, we had 3 narrators that help to draw those interviews together through a themed episodes. But you also hear a lot of conversational style podcasts. So Radio Lab might be considered this, where people talk back and forth. You hear monologues where people might just tell a very long story or speak on their own. One of my favorite bedtime podcasts is called Lore, where he just tells frightening stories that mixed with history, kind of fairy tale-esque, but like Grimm Brothers style. And it's not the content, it's his voice that is the most amazing sleep inducer. There's also storytelling, investigative podcasts. Yes, Serial would be a great example of that. We have roundtables and panels, theatrical, where people are performing as different characters, and it's more of like a theater production. We also have repurposed content. So like say the Daily Show or any of these where they draw from a lot of news clips and then they kind of riff on it. That would be considered to be in that category. So as we think about our own content, we have to ask ourselves whose voices are going to be heard on this podcast. And what is the knowledge that those voices are capable of sharing and that I want to share through that? So one thing we decided early on with social fishing is we really wanted the voices of the fishermen to be front and center. We wanted to devote as much time as possible to those voices. And so our narration could have gone a different direction where we spent more time talking about each thing that the interviewees said. But we really felt like getting to highlight their own words, giving them the platform to tell their own story was the direction we wanted to go. And that's a choice. These are all choices that need to be made early on, but they can also evolve. All of these things can shift over time. So the technical side of podcasting, I get asked about this a lot. So you need really a few basics. And I'm going to say right now, you do not need nice stuff to make a nice podcast. You can easily use what your computer already has and free software to do pretty much everything. So I use a high-end microphone because I am doing this professionally at this point, and because I think it makes a big difference in the overall quality of the podcast. But I can turn this off. It's also possible to do a podcast without any of those things. Your voice will sound also completely passable. You could add a filter onto it later if you're really concerned about it. But having the control and the practice that we discussed earlier, that's really where the quality of sound comes from. So using the nice fancy microphone, yes, it certainly helps. In no way am I going to hit the wrong button. In no way am I going to say that it doesn't. Using the mute button correctly is a much bigger factor, but having nice gear, optional. There are a lot of, so this is a microphone that uses what's called a preamp. And that's like a little box that does all of the mechanical stuff of a microphone. This is where my tech knowledge runs into a wall here. But essentially all of the processing of the signal is done separately from the actual microphone itself. This is just a microphone I could screw in, screw out from this stand here. This is a pop filter, so you can kind of get a better look at it there. When we, in English in particular, we say a lot of P's, and we pop those P's, and that's a very obnoxious sound to hear over and over again. So this filter, it helps a little bit, but you also need to learn to speak where you don't enunciate those things really harshly. And again, you're working with the thing that's receiving your voice has its own limitations. So getting to know your equipment is a big deal. If you were using some headphones that had a little microphone here, that could also work, but then you would want to make sure that that it stays equidistant from your face, and you'd want to practice. Does it sound good out here? Does it sound good right here? Where do I need that microphone to be so that the sound is consistent, which makes it a lot easier to edit later. You can get a lot of pretty good microphones these days for not very much money that have all of the stuff built into the microphone itself, and you plug it into your computer with a USB cord. So it's their Blue Yeti is a favorite of mine. This is not that. This is a very different setup with a big arm that's latched to my desk, so I can kind of move it around and do things. But those Blue Yetis are great. You can plug it in, turn it on, use it, put it to the side for the rest of your day. You do need some sort of way to process your data. So a computer, laptop, you don't need that much power to do most of this. Sound editing itself is not that processing intensive unless you have some really advanced projects. But most of you probably won't be doing that for something like a project, or excuse me, something like a one-off episode. Mixing and editing software, also something you'll need. You can spend a lot of money on this, or you can get free versions. Audacity, and there will be a link to it later in this podcast or in this presentation. Audacity is free open source software that works on anybody's operating system, as far as I understand. And it's a little clunky, But it does the job, and we use it for our pubcasts, which is a different product we make where we do annotated and abridged readings of peer-reviewed literature that we've written in an effort to make that more accessible to a wider variety of audiences. Finally, you have to decide, how are you going to get your podcast out there? And again, I'll go into a bit more of this when we are planning our own projects, but essentially you need to choose a place where you're going to host your RSS feed. And this is something like SoundCloud or Anchor or any number of places where you can create an account, you can upload an audio file, and then you can link to that and share it that way. Or many of these, if you have a subscription to those services, they will distribute to all of the major streaming platforms for you. So we use SoundCloud. We use a pro version of SoundCloud. I think it's like 75 a year or something. I'd have to look at which one we have, but it goes to Spotify, to Apple Music, to et cetera, like all of these different places with every time we just say publish. So we don't have to do any of that. It just shows up on its own. Most of the time it shows up pretty instantaneously within a few minutes. It's on those platforms. But you know, sometimes you find it takes longer for reasons that are beyond my pay grade. So these are kind of the basics. I do link down here. We wrote a technical details protocol where we list in with brand names and et cetera, everything that we use to make our podcast. It's free and online and easy to find, and you can link it there. Main takeaway here is making a great podcast does not cost a lot of money, and don't, I guess, get suckered in by by the need to have fancy equipment. The content, the story crafting, and the way that you present your own voice or the voices of whoever else is on the podcast with you is what makes or breaks a great podcast. As it is. Okay, so we are at a great spot to have a break. So I'm going to say let's come back in 10 minutes at 1:57. And then we're going to get into the more hands-on part of this and talk about turning your individual ideas into a podcast episode. So I'll see you back here in 10 minutes. All right. If we're about ready, we can get going here again. All right, I'm going to get started. There's Kyle. Okay, awesome. All right, so welcome back. In part two, we are going to talk about your ideas for a possible podcast and hopefully develop to a certain degree what that process is going to look like for you and get you thinking about the questions you'll need to answer to be able to do that successfully. So in the kind of pre-meeting email, I asked everyone to think of some of the work that they've been doing, ideas they have, projects they've had, and try and identify something that you thought would make a good podcast episode or series. So let's talk about that. I'd love to hear some of your ideas, and then the next step is going to be to break into a breakout room and talk about those things and work on some of the key ideas, which I'll give to you here in a second. But until then, let's hear some of your ideas. What are some of the things that you'd like to mobilize through a podcast?
I guess I'll share if no one else wants to at this point. So I am wrapping up data collection for my dissertation, and it's on how the pandemic has impacted youth sport participation for Ontario families. And so the pandemic has seemed to amplify some pre-existing tensions, as well as create new ones for youth sport. So I'd love to have some sort of podcast that unpacks those tensions, what the causes and the roots are, as well as perhaps some solutions, bringing in stakeholder perspectives, so youth, their parents, sport providers, municipalities, from different perspectives. So that's as far as I got so far. But yeah, something about unpacking tensions and possibly coming up with some creative solutions.
That is such an awesome idea. And I love that you've already identified which voices you would want to hear in that, or that you'd want to feature in that. So that's excellent idea. Really, really good example. And great that you can use that to talk about the research you've done as you're kind of getting to the dissertation writing stage. Awesome. Any others?
I'll go if you want to, if nobody else does. I did a few projects where I did kind of case studies around different sports events, actually. So like events with really interesting kind of community elements to them. So the way they're organized or kind of performed. So I was thinking about, it would be cool to feature each of these events in different rural communities and how they reflect community, and to tell the stories of those events in episodes each, I guess.
Oh, so cool. So a kind of a different idea where you're focusing on an event instead of presenting a series of findings, and trying to use one episode to really bring the listener to that place and let them understand that event through that experience. Also an awesome idea, and a great example of how they can be such different formats, and have kind of different goals with the outcome there. So those are great. I'll just add a few more details here. So in planning a podcast, we've talked about a few of the elements that we need to consider. I'm going to draw your attention to, in the email that was sent out to you, there was a link to the Amplify Podcast Network guidebook. This is put together by Stacey Copeland and Hannah McGregor at Simon Fraser University. I think Stacey might be somewhere else, but I don't recall where. But anyway, they are two incredible academics who are working on kind of the cutting edge of scholarship and podcasting. And they've developed a peer review system for Dr. McGregor's podcast called Witch Please, which is a reading or an analysis of the Harry Potter novels through a critical feminist lens. Amazing. That she also makes Secret Feminist Agenda, highly recommend. really just an incredible scholar, an incredible podcast, but they've put together this guidebook. And if you have that, you might pull it up now because it might really help you in this next stage of our work here. But here's your challenge. So we're going to get into some groups for about 15 minutes. And in that, you can either pick an idea from the group, or each of you can do this to your own idea within the group. No rules there. But I want you to think about your idea, articulate it, say, here's what I want to talk about or show people. And here's what I want the audience to understand. So you're going to choose a format around your topic. You're going to just think about your budget and resources. So this could be, what do I have now that I could use? Could I get my hands on a microphone if I wanted to try that route? Key to this is your time. What sort of time do you have? A social distancing episode from start to finish took anywhere between 8 and 16 hours to make. That includes the interviewing, the writing of the script, the processing of all of the audio, et cetera, plus anything we did additionally with that, which I'll get to later as well. So think about your time. I want you, you don't need to do these last bits, but these are some of the other things that we would normally ask if this was a real podcast that you were coming to try and get developed today. So hosting platforms, the duration, are you going to make one episode? Are you going to make 5? The example of the impact of COVID on sports in Ontario, that might be a great series. Or maybe it's one really long, dense episode, so think about that. The other thing that we would want you to consider is the frequency at which you're going to share this information. So is it once a week? That's an extremely strenuous schedule if for a person who is otherwise employed. If this is your full-time job, then knock yourself out. But otherwise, it's time consuming. This podcasting is a lot of work to make good, compelling, story-rich podcasts. Anyway, so consider all of these things. I want you to just focus on these questions, though. Choosing the format, who is involved, the voices that would be featured, your resources and budget, and who is your audience. So those are the 4 questions that you need to answer, either about one idea for your whole group or about each person in the group. So I think Tammy is going to help me now and divide people out. We have 8 folks, so we could easily just do 2 groups. And have everybody go in there. And I'm going to give you a few minutes, and then I'll come in and visit, and we can talk through some of your ideas.
I'll go in a room too, Tammy, if you want. You can plug me into one.
Yeah, it's just moving everyone in, and then I will try and move you into one.
Okay, cool. We lost lots of people this round.
Yes, I noticed that. Actually, you know what? I think you have to move yourself.
Oh, okay.
Yes, yeah, I think you can just, if you hit breakout rooms, it'll show you, and then I think you can say join.
Cool.
The idea. Well, we're back with recording. Yay. The things that you want to include in your podcast, the topic, who's going to be speaking. Great. Those are some of the core things that have to get sorted first. The next things are the actual kind of pieces of how to put it together. And I'm going to walk you through this because I think it seems self-explanatory, but then it totally isn't. So there are different ways to do this. This is just what works for us. I'm sure other people have different approaches. But one of the first things that we do after we have our content and we've done our interviews is we write a script. The reason we do that is because there were 3 of us doing this work. Can you still see my screen okay? I should ask, what does my screen show you? Does it show you a script?
No, we see the slides and now we see nothing.
Yes, now you see nothing. Okay. But now you shall see a script. Okay. So the reason that we do the scripting, and I'll make this a lot bigger for you here, is because there were 3 of us producing this podcast, and because it is hard to ad lib well. Extemporaneous speaking is a skill that must be practiced. That is not what academia promotes. So we said, okay, we want to make sure that it sounds polished. We want to make sure that we get all the information in there. The best way to do that is to draft a script. So I'm using episode 16 because I'm going to use this as an ongoing example from here on out. But this was an episode about working waterfronts. So I'm going to walk you through what's in a script that we do the whole thing on Google Docs so we can share and we can work together on it. We have our title. We have some musical intro that we know will set up the tone. We rotate who does what parts. So in this case, this week, Phil was going to read the beginning. We have another little bit of intro music, and then we have some intro clips. So this is pieces from our interviews that just give a little snippet, a tasty little snippet of what's going to be in that episode. We don't put what those clips are here unless we pick them and said, oh, you got to use this one, because we know that as Phil puts together the episode, he's going to pull the stuff he thinks is really juicy and put it here. So that was kind of a producer's call. So then we go into introducing ourselves. We know our names, but it's really handy to have all of this in here every week anyway. It also builds consistency. Like you develop kind of the muscle memory for how your episodes sound. We always have this bit about who is Coastal Roots. And then we immediately get into talking about the topic. So this first little bit is the same in every episode. It's just a rotating schedule of who says what. Then we jump into it. So here we're talking about working waterfronts. Emily introduces the idea of what that is. I talk about kind of the general definition, and then Phil poses a question, and then he answers the question because, rude to not answer. This is a long chunk, I'll say. This whole thing, this is a lot for one person to say. You'll notice that we introduce a speaker here. I say it's a lot for one person to say. We usually try and create shorter paragraphs because otherwise you're speaking for multiple tens of seconds, I guess. And that is a long way to perfectly read something. And we're just not very good at that unless you practice it a lot. So it's better to have short bits. You'll see we introduce somebody. We spell out their name phonetically. So because I interviewed this person, but Phil is the one who's going to introduce their name. So we need to make sure that's really clear. And then we jump in. So here, now we have Monique speaking, and this is her interview tape. So we called this time stamping. I'm sure it must have a different name, but essentially in the interview, I think this interview took about 45 minutes. From minute 3 minutes and 9 seconds in to 4 minutes and 17 seconds in, that's the part that I would like to share first. And here's an incredibly brief and not very in-depth summary of what that clip will say. Phil so this is another thing. If you work with a co-host, you got to trust your co-hosts. So I did the interview. My team had to trust that I did a good interview, that I got good content from this person, and that then I'm representing it accurately when I offer these timestamps is what I think should be played here. So now Emily transitions from this. So this is about a little over a minute, and then this is about a minute and a half. So we have about 2.5 minutes of Monique speaking. That is a long time. If we think about how long you can hold your breath for, 30 seconds, could you do it for a full minute? Probably not. So when you are listening to one voice for this long and you're trying to pay attention to what they're saying, because you only get this much of it, you want to make sure that either what they're saying is super compelling, that they're great at really presenting that information and you feel hooked the whole time. We can all think of a person who speaks like that, where you're just like, wow, everything they say is amazing. Or you need to break it up. It's hard to listen. Monologuing is not ideal. We also don't have any music playing behind this person right now. So we're listening to just a dry, singular voice, no lovely melody to help support the interest. So Emily breaks it up. We get back in. Here's now a 30-second clip, a little bit shorter, helps the audience stay together with it. I transition again. Again, we have kind of a long segment here. Monique is an incredible speaker, so I was not worried that she wouldn't be compelling. Phil jumps in a little bit more. So you can kind of see the pattern that we establish here. And each time, because Phil is looking at this script as literally the blueprint for how to put together the episode, we make sure each person is initialed every single time, and that there's information about it. So let's say I make a mistake and my timestamp number is somehow wrong. By putting this little summary of what it should be, Phil can make sure that it matches, that this is actually correct, right? So putting in kind of checks and balances for quality control. You'll also notice that up here we start with some low numbers, then higher numbers, but then back to some lower numbers in terms of time. So we're jumping back and forth in the interview. And when I put the script together, I was thinking, she talks about this thing, and then we come back to it over here. And then she made this really good point of it toward the end when we kind of wrapped up. Those are all things that fit together when I'm summarizing her interview. In the conversation, we can jump all over the place, but it's really hard to follow that as a listener if the person jumps all over the place in their different segments. So you want to try and essentially cut up your conversation and organize it by theme, which might sound really, if you're a qualitative researcher, this might sound very familiar with doing thematic coding, that you're looking to identify things throughout and then fit them together so that they make sense, family them together, or however you like to think about it. So we have one person, we leave that person, we jump now to a new person, Melissa Collier, and then we're now jumping into her bit. Melissa is also a good speaker, but she's slower and she's a little bit less emphatic. So here we're looking to make sure that we're still using some longer clips, but we're being careful, making sure that she's answering specific things here. And in this case, she's talking about a big fire that happened. So it's kind of a dramatic topic. We're imagining the loss that the fire created. So that the content can sometimes help support a person who may not be that emphatic of a speaker on their own. Then we get down to Anthony. So there's 4 guests in this episode. I'm going to tell you that's a lot. That's 7 speakers that any listener to this episode has to identify and follow along. The 3 narrators and the 4 guests. I think the most we ever had was 7 guests in one episode, because we were doing a kind of a roundup of what's going on. Way too many. Don't do that. It's crazy. Like, to give everyone enough time to speak and to, I don't know. No, not good. So don't go too crazy on how many voices you expect someone to follow along with. Also important to note that people have different sounding voices, but sometimes not that different. So Monique and Melissa sound very different from each other. I've had no question that the audience would know who was speaking when I put this together. In this case, I have Anthony. He has some kind of long-ish clips, but not very many, because we're just asking him to talk about a very short, small piece of this topic. And we actually added in his interview because the interview that he did with Emily was about something else, but he came around to this topic on his own during that interview. And we were like, oh man, that fits really well. We're about to talk about that for a different episode. Let's throw him in. So we decided to include him. But Carson and Anthony sound also very different from each other. So we were able to put those back to back. If both the men and both the women that we feature in this had somewhat similar voices, I would almost certainly have moved them to man, woman, or woman, man, whatever, so that their voice is deeply distinct from the next speaker. Or if their voices sound like my voice, or their voices sound like Emily or like Phil. Fortunately, we all have pretty distinct voices also. But that things to consider is how, if I want my listener to be able to follow along while they're vacuuming, follow along while they're doing the dishes, while they're cooking, make sure that those things are distinguishable. This is one of my biggest pet peeves, which is why I'm going on and on about it, is like when you watch a movie or you listen to something and all of the characters look so similar, and all you needed was just dye someone's hair a different color, and it would have been very obvious, a visual signal that this is a different person, but they don't do that. I don't know why. Anyway, don't create this problem in your podcast. Anywho, so we talked, what the other thing that we're doing here is Monique is an expert on working waterfronts. So she sets up this really informative discussion of the problems. Then we go to Melissa. Melissa is a fisherman. Melissa tells personal stories about her challenges with working waterfronts. Then we go to Anthony. Anthony works for Fogo, or is part of Fogo Island Fish and the Fogo Island community. He's talking about kind of broad, again, more high level coastal communities, municipal governance of coastal communities and working waterfronts, and then takes a swing at Toronto, as if you want to see a failure of waterfront management, you just look at the city of Toronto. And I was like, ooh, spicy. So like, you're kind of putting something exciting right there in the middle, right when like maybe interest could be waning if people don't love working waterfronts for some reason. And then we finish with Carson. Carson tells a fantastic local story not to Lake Ontario, but to Lake Erie near Toronto, about getting ousted from their working waterfront and the challenges that has brought. So we've crafted this story to be informational, personal, informational, spicy, super personal, and kind of leaving you with this lingering sense of, should it be like, what about my working waterfront? Okay, so that's what we intended. Whether or not that's what people feel, but that was the idea. Is we wanted to craft it together intentionally in that way, thinking of voices, thinking of theme, thinking of story arc. So this is essentially what the scripts look like. This part is always the same here at the end. We like that because it allows us, it makes scripting easier when you can copy paste chunks of it over and over again and just alter little bits and pieces. Because like we change the names of who people heard from, et cetera, et cetera. But it also creates continuity, that the candor and the rhythm of your, the timbre and the rhythm of your podcast builds familiarity with your core listenership. So that's what scripting looks like. This is about, I don't have page numbers on this one, but I'm guessing this is about 4 to 5 pages. This is a 25-ish minute episode. So one page can take you up to 5 minutes to get through when you account for your time stamping. So keep in mind that most people don't want to listen to anything probably more than 20 to 30 minutes. You don't see many podcast episodes that are way longer than that unless they're really compelling. So things to consider as you put yours together and you plan out an episode strategy of, how much content can I cover in just one episode? Less than you think is the answer. All right. So let's then go to back to our talk. And we're going to talk now about recording. So recording, and I won't make this big because we're going to jump back and forth a little. Well, yes, I will. Never mind. Recording for us, all done on Zoom. Yay, COVID. So that was also another reason that we went with like higher end equipment is we knew we were going to do this. Our project funds paid for some of this. So that was also, a huge help. But we knew that the internet was going to be yet another obstacle and changing the tone and the quality of our sound. So we wanted to try and get out in front of that as much as possible. If you're recording in person with your guests, that really makes it a lot easier because you can sit there and see each other and work together. We had to kind of do it all with like muting ourselves and unmuting ourselves. And we would get together every Friday morning at 9 a.m. to do a complete like rehearsal run through of the script as if we were recording, mess up a bunch of times, fix the things that sounded good when we wrote them and were not so good when we had to say them out loud. And then we would click record and do the whole thing in one go. I think only once did we ever manage it completely without mistakes. But that's the magic of then the editing process where you can cut out all of those mistakes. So this is where I mentioned Audacity Software. Here's the link for that there with the microphone. We use Hindenburg, again, because we had the funding in our project to purchase it. And that's what you're seeing here is it's just a screenshot from what it looks like. So the episode, I don't remember the number now, but the episode that we did on methods talks about this process in more depth, as does the protocol we released. So if you want to kind of learn more about editing, that's a good place to look for that information. But essentially, this is another learning curve. You will get better at it. It is frustrating at first because you have to spend a lot of time cutting up tiny little bits of audio. But once you get good at it, you'll learn some tricks and it becomes much easier. Audacity is a great beginner place to learn that. But this is what it looks like, creating all these separate tracks for all the separate speakers, for your music, for any sound effects that you want to use, and then creating that into a project file that you can then upload to the place that you want to host it. So we host on SoundCloud. This is what that looks like from my perspective. I'll actually jump into the real thing here so you can see that. Get out of this. Yes. You can see that. Excellent. Okay. So this is what it looks like for Coastal Roots Radio. We chose SoundCloud because it was easy. The price point was in a good spot for us at the time we were doing this. And I like the interface. I think it's quite easy to work with. We can see all of our tracks and how many listens they get, the kind of engagement they get, as well as our stats. So I can see whoever went crazy on Monday listening to a bunch of old episodes. Thank you. But you can kind of see like where the interest is following along. And it can also show you the impact of doing additional add-on things. And that's what I'm going to end on here today, because I think someone mentioned in one of their groups, the challenges of justifying the time. That is a real thing. It is time consuming. How do you make it worth it? You do that by essentially, in my view, adopting an add-on approach to podcasting. So I gave you the example of the Working Waterfronts episode, because when we made that episode, it was part of my ongoing work with Great Lakes fishermen. It was an interview with him that, with Carson, who is a regular participant. He was like, hey, this thing happened. And I was like, get out of here. Let's talk about it. Do you want to be on a podcast? And he said, sure. So he was happy to tell his story with some coaching. Like he was nervous. So we had to kind of coach a good version of his story that wasn't going to get him in any trouble locally. But we released that episode. And then I immediately drafted this article for the conversation and pitched it, which they liked. In it, I linked to our podcast and that episode in particular, so that people can go back and hear that story if they're interested in. But I also draw from the story, from that interview material, to start this piece. We did the same thing when we had the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Coast Guard on our show. We pitched it to the local newspaper and said, hey, we're having a big guest. Can you write about our podcast? And they were like, sure. Slow news day, maybe, who knows? But nonetheless, it double dipped on this episode. It put it out there in front of more people. It kind of elevated the profile of what we were doing. Same thing, the NPR station out of Northern New York. I reached out to them and to a handful of other news groups. This is one of the few that responded, and said, hey, I'm really interested in this Working Waterfronts issue. It's affecting the Great Lakes as a whole. We've just done some episodes about it. Are you interested in covering it? And they said yes. So again, they linked to the podcast. They quote from the podcast. So they were able to listen to source material and quote it. And then they asked for photos. So I was able to contribute more of my work. And it talks about, this isn't now me writing about it. This is someone writing about my work with this and the podcast. And finally, go on other podcasts. This is the thing with long running podcasts, is they run out of material. And so they really need guests who are willing to come and talk about whatever they're doing. There's a lot of them out there. Find them. Whatever your field is, find everyone who makes a podcast about it and be like, hey, if you're ever looking for guests, I'd love to come on and talk about what I'm doing. You would not believe how many people will eagerly say yes. So I've been on a number of shows now where I'm talking about the research, but I always bring up the podcast. So in this way, the podcast has gotten covered by dozens of publications. And I've been able to kind of extend the value of that product over and over again. And as have my co-hosts, certainly not a solo gig here. The other way that you can do that is not just through the media, but also looking inwardly at academia. So academics really like to talk about new ways to do knowledge mobilization. So the Canadian Science Publishing Group, they were really interested in the pubcast format as a new way of doing dissemination of peer-reviewed work. The Marine Social Science Network, with whom we work a little bit, was also really interested in podcasting. We asked them if we could do a blog post because they have an open call for blog posts. This is a low barrier to entry, short, not very time-consuming thing to write, but you can feature all of the other work you're doing with your podcast. And then they asked us to come back and do a webinar for them to talk about the approach to podcasting itself. We were happy to do that. You can find the link here. And this, of course, we're not the only ones who are doing this. So I mentioned Dr. Hannah McGregor and her partners, that they're doing this Secret Feminist Agenda as a test case for peer-reviewed podcasting, which is so brilliant and amazing. So here's the University Affairs writing about that. All of these are great ways to get that add-on value to the time you've invested in creating that podcast. So I know we're at the end of our time. I am going to stop there. I know Kyle also had announcements. So thank you very, very, very much for having me. This has been such a pleasure. I love talking about this stuff. And I'm very happy to answer questions now or by email later, if that's your preference.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We definitely have time for questions. So if people have questions, let's take a second here and do questions. And then I just have a few kind of parting words. Carrie, I see your hand up. Go for it. There's a small group, so just everybody jump in.
I didn't want to be rude. Thank you for sharing your experience with us and for sharing another way to get our research out there. I have two questions. The first is about ethics and where that fits and where podcasts fit with ethics, particularly since you're based at a university. So if you could speak a little bit to that, that would be really helpful.
Absolutely. And such a good question. I really appreciate you bringing that up because I always forget to mention it. So this is a complicated question. You should talk to your REB office about it if you're planning to mix podcasting and the pleasure of research at all. We mix them. And so we went through this process. And essentially, we were advised that anything that is in the public domain, such as podcast material, is fair game for research. So you can mine your own content if it's turned into a public product first. My personal view is that comes with some deep ethical ramifications. So we would go to someone and say, hey, we're making a podcast. We'd love to interview you for it. And they'd say, awesome. We'd be like, great. Here's the podcast release form that describes our podcast. I'm pretty sure we found one online and just adapted it to our own thing. So we could say people are consenting. They know that we're going to use it for these purposes, et cetera. So everyone signed a podcast release form. We then turned their interviews into the episodes, but only parts of their interviews get into those episodes. And they aren't consenting by signing that first form to participating in research. Maybe they will have a different feeling about that. So we started also, when we realized that we wanted to do that, we went back to everyone we already talked to and said, hi, your interview is so great. We're now thinking that what we've learned through this podcasting process would make a great research project. We'd really like to include your interview in that research data set. Is that okay? And if they were like, yeah, sure, sounds good, we'd be like, great, here is a REB approved consent form. Do you mind also please signing this? So every single person that we used in our study who was on the podcast also signed a consent form. The one thing about that you have to write into your consent form and that you should talk about with your REB office is you cannot guarantee anonymity if that is something you normally promise through, like in this case, qualitative work. You cannot guarantee anonymity because there is a possibility that if you select a quote to put in a peer-reviewed piece and it happens to be something that was also on the podcast, in theory, someone could figure that out and know who said it. So you have to let them know that is a limitation that you are unable to make any promises about. Are they truly comfortable with that? Chances are they totally are because they already attributed their name to it on a podcast. And so will they really mind it that someone figures that out in a peer-reviewed paper somewhere? Probably not. But our team's view was it does not matter. You must make them fully aware of what they are truly consenting to and the additional risks presented to that by being on the podcast as well. That said, you could totally listen to other people's podcasts and use the content from those in research, as far as we understand it. And it is also a nice way to be able to start interviewing now. And one might consider this to be ethically dubious, but if you have a project, so we knew we wanted to follow along with the COVID-19 changes in fisheries, by interviewing under the podcast consent form, we could do those interviews. We could immediately launch into them. To use them for research, we still had to go through that REB process, which COVID was affecting dramatically and took months and months. So we had this in mind, but we couldn't touch the research part of it until that part was done. And then we had to go back and reconsent everybody in, as I already described. So in a way, it's almost a cool tool to be able to keep up with radical change in society or whatever it is you study, and be able to do all of that data collection in a reasonable way. However, it does present this then much more ethically challenging back end that you need to wade through carefully. So long story short, be ethical about it and make sure people know what they're consenting to and that you're using interviews with full informed consent for both purposes. But we found that as actually a really wonderful way to adapt to COVID quickly.
Great. Thank you. And then I did have a second question really quickly, because you kind of already answered it, but I'm wondering, like, when you created your episodes and your interview guide, again, it's a kind of a chicken or an egg or the egg question. Like, did you ask interview questions based on what you thought you wanted the episodes to be, or did you just do interviews and then like figure out the episodes from the narrative? Like, how did that process? And I mean, that's like also a larger like research process question, but how did that look like logistically for the purposes of creating podcast episodes?
Sure. Yeah. So great question. Like most qualitative work, it was iterative. So we heard the phenomenon happening through our networks. It's when COVID kicked in, we heard about it happening. So we were like, let's ask people what they're seeing. Those first interviews were just, what is going on? Tell us what's happening. What do you see? So that was kind of, I guess, COVID before the script, as it were. But then as we started going, we said, wow, this is what a cool way to be able to do some of this work. I bet there's a lot of things, cool topics we could talk about. So then we started brainstorming a topic list. And ways that we wanted to talk about seafood in general with this COVID-19 lens. So we followed that list to some degree, where we'd say, okay, next time we want to talk about the Gulf fisheries, Gulf of Mexico fisheries. So we got to find some people down there. So let's reach out to our networks and see if we have any Gulf fishermen who want to talk about their experience, whatever's going on. When we talked, we did a red sky in the morning, which red sky in the morning, sailor take warning is an old nautical saying. So we were talking about disaster. And so when we did that one, we had heard about, I had read about a big explosion and huge fire, I believe in San Francisco, on a pier that had stored millions of dollars worth of fishing gear, and what a huge loss this was. So we said, well, that's a great place to start. But then we also had a hurricane happen in the Gulf. That was we knew someone there who could talk about that experience. We had a man overboard, maybe. I don't recall the other ones there. But anyway, we had some major events all happen at once. So that was kind of a pivot where we said, okay, who do we know who knows about that event? Let's call them up or ask if we can find somebody who can talk about that. And that was also a meaningful shift in our COVID narrative, because it was where the rest of normal life and the disasters of normal life caught up with the pandemic. And that was like kind of a meaningful milestone in the development of our understanding of the research also, because we said, wow, COVID affects you this way. And then it has this add-on effect where you're less resilient to normal disaster, which was, an important finding. So anyway, it was kind of back and forth between those two options, is long story short, where we had some ideas that we could respond to, but then sometimes things came up that we wanted to jump on right away. And we were able to do that. I don't know if that was helpful at all.
Awesome.
Yeah,
any other questions folks had? Cool. Well, I will finish it off just by saying thank you so much. This was really amazing. It was amazing to see how I hope everyone else noticed this, but some of the threads that we kind of pulled through all these different sessions. So links all the way back to the first session with Sydney when we talked about, conceptualizing audiences and thinking about who you're trying to reach and how you're trying to reach them. And then, the other sessions that we've had as well. So this was a really awesome way to cap this off. Thank you so much as well for linking all those resources. That's super helpful. So everyone, you'll get the slides like you have before. Tammy will send out a message to everyone and share that stuff with you so that you'll have access. And then just the final thing, we're running a little evaluation. So I think Tammy just plugged that into the chat. So if you could just take a second to fill that out. It'll also come out in an email. So you'll have the link there as well. But if you could please take the time to just fill that out and help us out, that would be great. Greatly appreciated and super helpful for us. And then I guess as a final point, just thank you all so much for attending these workshops. It's been super fun these last 4 weeks. I've been looking forward to Wednesday afternoons because it's been fun to see in our group, we were talking about how it's fun to do something with the same people. Like we have all these Zoom meetings with random people that like jump in and out, but it was fun seeing the same kind of fun and familiar faces for 4 weeks. So that is awesome. And I just want to say thank you as well on behalf of the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation. This is part of their kind of programming that we've been working on. So thank you to Hannah, and then thank you to everyone for that as well. There is the kind of add-on opportunity that I think I've mentioned in some of the correspondence. So we do have a spring conference coming up, ideally if all goes back to normal and we're able to travel. So if you are interested, there'll be an opportunity for students to develop a knowledge translation output. It can be any kind of output that you'd like, and then to come and share that at that meeting. And then we do have funding to support student kind of travel and accommodation for that. So you'll get at the end of that evaluation, there's a spot where if you are interested in taking up that opportunity, you can put your contact information, and then I won't have to send the information to everyone. I can just send it to those people who are interested. But it's a cool opportunity. The meeting will be in Rimouski, so I think actually it's kind of in the middle of where everybody is, which is kind of cool. It'll be interesting opportunity, and there will be opportunities. The one kind of caveat to that is it's got to be rural focused in some way because it's the rural development meeting. But we're happy to loop people in with scholars or mentors who can share some of their work and kind of work on that as well. So if you're not necessarily working on something related to rural development, we can connect you in with somebody and maybe find some middle ground where you can work on that. So I'm happy to answer any questions people have about that. Feel free to send me an email. Tammy's also going to send out all this information in an email to everyone. So watch for that. And then that's all that I got. Thank you so much. Again, thank you so much, Hannah. This was fantastic. It was super, super interesting and exciting. And I've got so much listening to do now to get caught up and hear all this stuff in full form. So I'm really looking forward to that. So yeah, thanks everybody so much. Have a great Wednesday, and I'll hang out here if anybody does have questions or anything they want to chat about after.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome.
Yeah, that was very interesting.
That's good. I feel like it should have been 3 hours. Like she could have like done a lot of stuff.
Yeah. And like I had to do like even for classes, like my kind of mini podcasting, like for assignments. And it's it would have been great to have this before, but you really have to go through the process to really kind of understand it. But once you understand it, like connecting the dots, it's really, really interesting. And people from my generation, like we're not into podcasting, right? Like I think I've listened to 2 or 3, but now I'm interested in, I'm going to stop the recording.